Okay, so our speaker tonight is Philip Pearson, who grew up in Brighton with strong links to the ocean. His grandfather was a submariner, and his great-grandfather was a crewman on the Challenger, which is kind of appropriate. So he did geography at London University and has an MA from Sussex. And in his career, amongst other things, he's held environmental and climate change briefs from the Trade Union Congress. And in retirement, he's written a book called The Challenger's Song, telling the story of the expedition based on family records. And he's currently working on another book called Remembered Lives to give a voice to the ordinary Challenger seamen. He's a member of the Challenger Society, of course, and he sings with the London Sea Shanty Collective that you might have heard on Radio 4 recently, I believe. I heard the back end of it.
Right.
Right. Okay, so over to you, Philip.
So just thank you very much, Phil and John, for setting this up. And it's great to see so many participants. What I would like to do today is really develop on the theme of my talk, which, as you may gather from this first slide, is Remembered Lives. This is the poster that I displayed at the Challenger conference in Oban in September. And I met Alex Murray, who the surname will be familiar. He's the great-grandson of Sir John Murray. He was at the conference and we shook hands, and it was really a treat to and a pleasure to meet him. But having got shared ancestry and, if you like, shared DNA, but his great-grandfather was up in the laboratory and mine was stoking down in the boiler hold. And of course, one couldn't have happened without the other. They depended on the steam engine, as we know from the explanations of the voyage, for it to be held steady head to wind when they were spending those many hours dropping the lines down to the bottom of the sea and taking all the soundings. So their roles were complementary. We have no idea if they met each other, knew each other, but they must have done, and had spent 3.5 years together. So there was that excitement of shared ancestry. And in the course of writing my first book, I've often wondered about what about the other sailors and what did they look like? Because I had a photograph of my great-grandfather, Charlie, which I found on a website, and we'll come on to Inaccessible Island later, but he was one of the crew who rescued the 2 German sailors that had been marooned on Inaccessible Island near Tristan da Cunha in the early part of the voyage. And in among that photograph, a relative of mine identified Charlie. And I was kind of thinking, well, how can we provide more information on the rest of the crew? Because we know so much about the scientists and the officers, and you'll go onto any website and you'll see images of them and much about their lives and their achievement. But as an author recently said, the stories of the sailors, the lives of the sailors are kind of unheard and unknown. And one of the sorry facts, if you like, about the voyage is there was a really, really high turnover. And because the Navy had vast resources at the time, all those that left were replaceable, and many have been forgotten. But if they've been forgotten by historians and so on, many are actually very well known to their descendants. And I've discovered that in the course of this research. And so the question that I've put on the slide, which I'd like to work through, is kind of what do we know of their lives and their achievements. So this is an enlargement of the top paragraph of that post, and you can see this array of individuals, and those with a music symbol next to their names were members of the band, and there are quite an array of people. I'll come back to the band later, but these photographs are enlargements and improvements on those half a dozen photographs that the first ship's photographer, Caleb Newbold, took of some of the crew during March 1873 on the way to St. Thomas or on St. Thomas. And there was no indication on the photographs, the official photos of their names, but fortunately, the kind of assiduous naturalist Herbert Moseley, he wrote the names of the sailors on the photographs. I discovered this when I was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, The half a dozen pictures of the crew with his careful annotations of their names along the bottom. And it's quite fascinating to be able to kind of identify who's who. And then at least we have around 70 sailors who we can remember what they look like. And there's such a range of characters as you might imagine. The bandmaster George Bird is top left, second in from that side. So, although my journey began with my great grandfather, it's travelled through kind of the lives of many other descendants during the course of this work. My structure of what I'd like to talk about is essentially a bit about the original crew. The band, the artist, there's a writer and a poet, there's Arctic explorers. There are three individuals whose stories are worth knowing. There's the inaccessible island story, and then there's some reflections. I just wanted to say that in the band, the artists and the writers and the explorers, there is an array of men, 20, 25, 30 men perhaps in total, about who had really remarkable lives and talents. And of course, so did the much better educated officers and scientists. But in the fuller story of the voyage, we have so much to understand about it from those other individuals on board. Or at least that's my contention. But first of all, a broad picture, the original challenge of crew, because it's impossible to explore the lives of the maybe 400 men crew who were recruited at some point. The original crew numbered, excluding officers and scientists, around 212. The numbers might vary depending on where you go for the sources, but my sources were the official Navy continuous service records of every sailor that I could find, including the Marines and 50 boys. And compared, and I've done some comparisons with the Challenger logbooks at the beginning and the end of the voyage, and I reckon these figures represent what happened to the originals. And it tells a story really of desertion and ill health. Not rife. Ill health wasn't rife. Desertion wasn't necessarily rife. But if you add these figures together, around 46%, that is 86 out of the grand total, didn't complete the voyage. There was a very large number of men deserted, and they seem to have jumped ship at virtually every major port of call. It seems that half of the runners were boys, and although the chief surgeon in his report, which is part of the official report of the expedition, kind of glosses over this and says, it was the attraction of Australian ports were chiefly responsible. I mean, yes, you kind of have to acknowledge that, okay, so the lives of these sailors, we can talk about why they would seize this opportunity in a colony such as Australia. But there's also a story linked to the design and organization of the voyage and the expectations of the crew, the unusual demands on labor and health. I mean, on the question of health, there was the really trying rapid change in climate from, let's say at the beginning, from you're from Halifax to the sailing straight into the Gulf Stream and the warm and very much warmer weather, and the conditions on board were incredibly damp, and there was so much ill health as a result of rapid changes of climate of that kind, particularly. And of course, there was what the sailors called the drudge, which is the repetitive nature of the work that they were required to undertake, with very little real satisfaction in understanding continuously the importance of that work. So I don't know. I don't see it as just the attractions of Australian ports, although that was really important. I mean, it's true that Sydney was a magnet for. I think I made it 29 deserters. That would be around 17 original crew jump ship and a dozen of the new men that had been brought in to replace those that had left earlier. I found the New South Wales police records and the notices in the Police Gazette with the £3 reward per head to bring these men to get these men arrested and returned to ship, and only 4 were captured in Sydney. It was many of them did successfully evade, and they're just untraceable now. Though I'd very much like to be able to find 1 or 2 of them, but that's not proven possible to date. So these figures I think tally very closely with the ship's books, and Joe Mackin, the diarist at the time, did say at one point, with the level of desertions going on, the captain was in a great way about it, and they were bringing replacements in who were, kind of the sailors that some of the other ships were really glad to get rid of. And maybe the initial commitment and enthusiasm of the ship, was replaced by, don't know, crew who were perhaps much less committed to I would say, the glamour and the opportunity of the original project. But, this is kind of a snapshot of the original Challenger crew, the 212 or so. And particularly then, just looking at 1 or 2, we're looking at some of the major categories. We've got the the success of the bandmaster George Bird, who managed to assemble from scratch an 11-piece band of volunteers. He tutored them. There was only one of the crew who I think played the bugle before. I think it might have been William Clunies, who was a drummer in the Royal Marines. Otherwise, they learned from scratch. And although Mackin records, that they made a dreadful din at the beginning, by the time they'd been underway, they'd reached St Thomas. They were producing some creditable music, and eventually the band, played a really creditable role in the kind of the diplomacy and the reputation of the voyage as they traveled from port to port, and major ports, not just, they spent some time in each port of the major ports, and they were entertaining royalty and civic dignitaries, and the band was playing a really, really important part. So I would say, credit is due to the bandmaster and these guys for a major part in the kind of reputational success of the voyage. And if you look at the photograph closely taken by Caleb Newbold, the trumpeter at the front, second from the right, is holding a pussycat in his lap. And Newbold always made sure that the photographs weren't just simply faces to camera, but had something of interest, not just the instruments. But you've got a cat, you put him on your lap, and maybe there's only one who's smiling. The guy at the front, second from the right, he's got a bit of a smile on his face. But it's a fascinating kind of, if you like, aspect of the remembered lives that these guys played all the way through the voyage and gave joy to the sailors and to those they entertained. This is the Herbert Moseley photograph at the Bodleian, where he's written the names of the sailors. You can see the cat more clearly. And, you've got this array of men who were eventually doing a really splendid job for the voyage. The bandmaster, he eventually retired to Sydney. And, my research is I made contact with his great-great-granddaughter, Wendy. We exchanged a lot of information. I sent her a copy of my book. She sent me information about her great-great-grandfather, and she told me about his life as a conductor, in the community. He was a musician. He could play a wide array of instruments, and he was just a kind of a known person in that family's history. their oral history and stuff and information that's backed up by, if you like, the official kind of census material. But the life of the man is really continued and extended. The stories about him is a classic case of remembered lives, and he was known about and much respected, and his name was passed down through his family. So, that's George Burden, that's the band, and I, love to hear him play, but I just don't have a recording. So, moving on, if I could, to the artists. Now, the folios of the kind of artisan artists weren't really discovered until the 1960s in a bookshop in Boston, and handed and sold to the State Library in New South Wales. Altogether, these two guys produced 60 watercolors of the Challenger, whether it was in peril or dredging or in a harbor. And interestingly, if you look at Benjamin Shepherd's style, first picture on the left, and John Arthur, the second, they knew each other, didn't they? They both adopted this kind of elliptical framing of the ship or their subject matter, which in the style of Victorian artists of that era draws the eye to the center of the picture. Benjamin Shepherd's on the left there is a very whimsical painting of the dredging line and mermaids helping to ferry, specimens into the net. And John Arthur there his pictures tell the story of the occasion in February 74 when the ship rammed an iceberg, and the descriptions of this incident are contained in Joe Matkins' account and in one of the senior officers' account. What's his name? I've forgotten his name. It'll come back to me. But the drama of the event, where as the ship is carried towards the berg by an undercurrent and by the sails that were then furled. So were then unfurled, and the descriptions of the, if you like, the drama on board are in the texts of various contributors. But the artist picture just says so much. If you look at the picture third from the left, you can see the men scrambling aloft, and we're talking about temperatures of -10, -20 degrees. It's incredibly cold. There's a blizzard blowing. You can see that the smokestack that the wind is blowing the ship towards the berg. You can see the collision point. You can see the men up aloft. I counted about 20 or 25 figures and those on deck. And they survived, and got my great-grandfather down in the hold there, must have been working like Billy-O to get full steam, and the ship is thrown into reverse. And because of the steam engine reversing or trying to, the impact is nothing like as bad as it could have been, and they survived. The picture on the right was taken when the ship's leadsman, Edward Winton, was swept overboard when the ship was on its way to Wellington. It was in the Cook Strait, which is one of the worst bits of sea available across the planet. The oceans meet there, don't they? The Pacific and is it the Indian? I'm not sure. But, terrible, terrible cross currents and the storm to boot. And a picture I particularly like and would like to share with you is John Arthur's painting of Christmas Harbour. Note the spelling. And this picture shows the ship at anchor with the steam engine keeping everyone kind of warm, the ship cozy, and the welcoming penguins and skuas and storm petrels and the albatrosses all kind of flocking in their different formations above the ship. And the Herbert Moseley describes this scene himself on page 162 of Notes by a Naturalist. He says, the whole beach of Christmas Harbour was covered with droves of the Johnny Penguin and the King Penguin, with establishments of these penguins on level grassy spaces far up the hill. And to the north, rookeries of the smaller crested penguin called rock hoppers by the whalers. And Joe Matkin adds, the largest and the handsomest of being the king penguin, which stands 3.5 feet tall with a golden crest on its head. Our men say they look like Russian sentries up the Crimea, for they stand stiff and immovable as a soldier, their flippers standing out straight. You know, this is the painting of those words. And, the official account was 130 years before this painting came to light. And they say a picture can speak 1,000 words, and both accounts are valid. And I think this stunning picture really adds so much to Moseley's description of what he saw, the setting, and also Joe's account, so often verified by other sources, Joe Matkin, the ship steward. So moving on then from the artists, so there were two artists whose work was not discovered until the 1960s and does not form part of the official account. There was an official artist on board, of course, and his work is beautiful. There's no doubt about that. But this stuff is more untutored, but very graphic in the stories that it also tells. So yeah, this is just a slide which quotes Arthur Moseley, which I spoke to just now. So, if I may, moving on to the written accounts of the voyage. And by the way, do interrupt me if you need to. Is that okay? I take it you are able to, right? So, writers and a poet. Well, the ship steward, he was 19 when he was on board, when he got on board. He wrote 69 letters home, as perhaps many of you do know. And I've trawled through them so many times, the book by Philip Raybock which brought together all that correspondence, which has got copious notes at the end. And it is a unique below decks account of the voyage. There's also Abraham Smith's memoir, published which was written in 1904 when he was, some few years before he died. He ended up being the kind of keeper of the castle by Sheerness. And there's Jack Skylight, the third writer, whose irreverent poem was written in 1874 to his old shipmate. And if I may just start with Jack Skylight, I don't know whether this is familiar to you, but this guy is an unknown contributor. It was written anonymously and delivered to the Cape Monthly when they're in Cape Town in December 1873. And you can hear this man's voice in his writing. I joined this craft last winter, got rated on a ledger, a swabber, jobber, scrubber, a sounder and a drudger, a scientific gentleman, our genius on the cruise. Well, it's got to be Thompson, isn't it? Explained to us the animals, their habits and their use, and every little blessed thing we drudge out of the sea was for the good of all mankind, including you and me. He told us that we'd all be dukes when this here cruise is done. I think he was mistaken, or he meant he would be one. And this is a reflection. This is kind of alluding to Professor Thompson's maybe one occasion, perhaps two, when he brought the crew together to very early on to explain the scientific purposes of the voyage and the unique contribution that the sailors were going to make for the good of all mankind. And I think I would say that um, the very good intentions, the sincerely good intentions at the beginning of the voyage to engage the crew in the scientific work um, didn't really fulfill their potential. And I think it became more and more a case. If you read some other paragraphs of Jack Skylight's poem, they just saw the drudge as really bloody hard work, you know. Um, and the line broke, as we know, and it killed a boy sailor very early on, one of the boys. Um, and it was dangerous work. Um, and in all weathers, they were, you know, lowering the machine, lowering the equipment to the seafloor, including well into the Southern Ocean, well into the extreme cold weather that we spoke about earlier. Um, so Abraham Smith, he wrote I don't know, 40-page memoir. It's in the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. He he alludes to one of the difficulties of the voyage that Joe Matkin speaks about, which is um, being away from family so long, with huge stretches of time and sea, where there was no news from home, you know, periods of up to a 12-month. And Abraham Smith refers to the hardest times in a sailor's day. The longest time we were at sea without sighting any land, with only the sea and the sky to look at, was 3 months. And 5 months was the longest time we ever stayed on board without once going on shore. These periods probably allude to time in the Southern Ocean. I would say that's probably where the 5 months period is referred to. It could equally well be when they were sailing towards Valparaiso, where they couldn't use the steam engine. They was preserving coal, and there was very little wind. It would appear that morale and separation were really a kind of really difficult to handle, and it's impossible to know whether kind of how men at that time coped. What did they speak to each other about this? Did they? We don't know. I mean, Joe Matkin writes an extraordinary account of the voyage from below decks, and throughout his account, he provides information about the scientific discoveries that are being made, the dredging, the depths that they were reaching. Just excuse me. When they sounded the Mariana Trench, he gives a very graphic description of the amazement, really, that a line was, reached the bottom of the sea at a greater length than the height of Everest above sea level. It's such a vast depth, extraordinary. But he sympathetically describes those occasions when, and there weren't many, but they did happen, when a man was lost at sea, such as Edward Winton, whom Joe describes as one of the finest men on board. He was just 25 years old and married, and there was a collection. And there was the occasion when the young boy sailor was also lost at sea. William Stokes, he was just hit by a bollard that broke loose when the line was under incredible tension early on. So then Joe describes, the upstairs, downstairs kind of thing. The officers would have officers and scientists would eat really well throughout the voyage. And, the sailors were on the salt pork and peas one day, and salt beef, and maybe, the hard biscuit and the cocoa for breakfast, compared with the provisions available to the officers. And very early on, I say after they'd been out at sea just before Christmas, on the first Christmas, the turkey and the goose were disappearing from the table. There was a clearly some kind of small scale rebellion going on board. It was it didn't happen throughout the voyage, but it was this continuing reference in Joe's account and one or two of the officers about the difference of diet available, which I think, probably had a telling effect on the men's health when they were facing the most demanding conditions. And of course, the work is too hard, as he says. But he also, as I note down the bottom of that slide, the greatest sounding, the kind of celebration that took place when they got to the Mariana Trench. John, I see your hand is up. Is that for my benefit?
No, it's me just
Okay.
clutching my chin.
Okay, all right. So, moving swiftly on. One thing that really fascinated me was that three of the sailors on board, Joseph Good, Spiro Capato, and George Winston, were selected by Captain Nares when they reached Hong Kong, and Nares was called back to London to head up the 1875 Arctic expedition. One of the Challenger, the Arctic expedition, and another expedition that Nares led at this time were all part of Britain's contribution to the kind of polar exploration decade that was taking place at that time. So, we've got these three guys, the coxswain Joseph Good, the boy sailor George Winston, who was apparently Good's nephew. I've not really been able to verify this, and domestic first class Spiro Capato. They went back to London, and many of you will perhaps aware that Nares's orders were to sail or attempt by sledge to reach the North Pole. Well, then I kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole here because, I found the accounts of the polar expedition, just wondering if these guys really did take part and what it was like. And, there are hundreds of pages of accounts of this expedition by the various sledge party leaders that were guys, who were given charge of the overland attempts. The ship kind of got stuck, as it obviously would have done, north of Greenland, on the northern shore of Greenland, I think. And they then set off, and the hardship these guys endured. It was scurvy because all of the lime juice froze, of course, and there was no fresh meat. They were out altogether around 85 days, 40 north and 40 coming back. And one guy lost his life, but they all suffered horrendously from the effects of lack of food, essentially, poor nourishment, and scurvy. Scurvy was just the scourge of this expedition. And they did endure unimaginable hardship. George was a boy from a Cirencester workhouse. So I was kind of interested to learn that each of these sailors, I think around possibly two ships worth, probably about 80 sailors. There were two ships on this expedition. They all got an Arctic medal for their endeavours, unlike the sailors, almost all the ordinary sailors on the Challenger, who were not recognised by a medal at that time. And you can see how the Arctic endurance would merit a medal. The contribution they made to scientific knowledge of that region. I mean, the measurements were taken of temperature and and ice depth and wildlife such as it was, But they each got a medal. Those who went to the Arctic, but not the Challenger. So I was very interested to find out a bit more about these three guys. The one that really fascinated me, and it seems to me to be a kind of a classic story of how boys were recruited to the Navy. And I think that many of the sailors of this time had a kind of life story not unlike George Winston, whose father died when he was very young. His mother had a number of other children to look after. The family was completely impoverished. He was consigned to Cirencester workhouse with his brother, where they were obliged to work by a master who's a stonemason. And they were charged by the master with neglecting their work. They were then taken to the Cirencester Assizes, where they were committed to 20. One of the boys was committed to 21 days in prison, and Winston for 14 days imprisonment. He was 12. He was 12 years old, 13 years old, and yet later, the same newspaper. He returns from the Arctic, a kind of hero. He arrives at the Cirencester station, and what had happened, he'd been taken under the wing of a Quaker, Miss Bowley, described as a poor fatherless lad, who encouraged him to join the Navy. And he was eventually, as I've said, was not just joined the Challenger, but then took part in the Arctic expedition. It's kind of from pauper to hero, really, and it's not an unusual journey, through extreme poverty, a period of imprisonment, and then some other pathway towards the Navy. Not all the sailors were kind of passed through the justice system, as it was, to the Navy, but poverty was I'm finding was so much in the background of these men. Yes, before I talk about how am I doing for time, by the way? What have I got?
I think maybe you got 10 minutes, Philip.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to mention another of the sailors whose photograph I discovered. It's a sailor called Anthony Delane, who was originally Anthony de Lara. His father was Italian. He lived he's from Dorchester. His family was evidently really, really poor. There were a lot of children, and he was arrested a couple of times for petty theft. The last of his charges was apparently standing charged with stealing horsehair from the carriage of Lady Anne Courtland with a friend of his. This was the third occasion where he'd been arrested. One was for begging, one was for sleeping rough. He had nowhere to live and was arrested for that. And he was up before Dorchester Assizes. The judge came to town, and there was a whole kind of procession of people with charges against them. These two young lads, him and his friend William Watch, who'd been arrested together, they're up in the dock, and taking into account their previous convictions, two for vagrancy, that was the one about sleeping in a barn, and one for stealing other bits and pieces from a couple of wealthy people. Their sentence was to be transported beyond the seas to such place as Her Majesty shall think fit for a term of 15 years. So for these young boys they were given an immensely harsh sentence. And for some reason, and it's not clear, but it may be that the judge was thought to have overreached himself, and the prison governor thought, actually, we need to do something about this. And a letter was written to the Home Secretary at the time, and their sentences were commuted to 4 years in a reformatory, and the reformatory turns out to have been a Royal Navy ship up in Liverpool, where they spent 4 years mandatory training as sailors before they were then shipped into the Navy. So, extreme poverty, petty crime, very harsh sentences, a pathway into the Navy. It's the stories about these young lads are really quite tough, I think. But with Joseph Good, who was the captain's coxswain, these are pictures of them from the Caleb Newbold photographs. These are the same guys in the later life, and I made contact with Joseph's descendant, Anthony Southcombe, who lives in Hendon, and we met, and he gave me this photograph of his great grandfather, who ended up being a prison guard at Dartmoor Prison, and before he retired. And Anthony Southcombe gave me a copy of the Great Frozen Sea by Captain A.H. Markham, one of the lieutenants on the Arctic voyage. I'm going to donate this book he gave me to the Maritime Museum because it's a first edition. And George McGrath on the right, he was originally one of the boy sailors on board, and he had a 10-year commission for the Navy, and after the 8th year, when another ship he was on got to California, he just deserted. He jumped ship. He got married. He had a family. He established himself in San Francisco, a businessman of some substance, and I made contact with his great grandson, Roy Rasmussen, and the guys remembered, as is my great grandfather, with a number of stories. And very near the end now, but this is the Inaccessible Island photograph that kind of brought me, I suppose, into play with the Challenger as in terms of its social history. Charlie is my great grandfather standing at the back of this photograph, circled, on the occasion when they rescued the two maroon German sailors. You can see the guy with the lighter jacket next to my great grandfather, and the guy holding a pipe. He's got a check shirt. He's third from the right. These are the rescued men, and this is the hut they were living in. And they were really lucky to survive. And it's a remarkable story of how the Challenger kind of diverted. I'm not sure they were going to return to Inaccessible Island, apart from doing the right thing and rescuing these two guys. There's a whole story there. So I think, just to wrap up really, Challenger's song was based fundamentally on my family's oral history and memories of my great grandfather, and also a wide range of archives, not just Navy records, but census and street directories, newspaper cuttings. And although accounts still speak of the anonymity and the unheard voices of the ordinary crew who drove the ship along, I think there is an opportunity to discard the anonymity for knowledge of their contribution and to give voice to it, so that we don't no longer speak of them as if they were a kind of replaceable and of little importance, if you may say. And the ship surgeon, well, he also said the medical history of the expedition is of little interest. Actually, I think it's a great deal. It is interesting in that the medical issues that were confronted during the expedition, the long duration, the changes in climate, the accidents at sea, all contributed to the very high turnover, which in some of the accounts of Nair's story suggests that he had to explain to his superiors, what was going on, because there was so many replacements. So to the question, who were the Challenger crew? What was their experience, and why did only 140 of the original crew complete the circumnavigation? I think there is an opportunity to provide a broader and more balanced answer to that question. Some of that answer, if you like, is in the book I wrote. This is a quick caption about it because, forgive me for slightly promoting this, but it's available on my website, and the link to the website is there, A Challenger's Song. And what am I going to try and do? Well, I hope to try and bring this together as a publication of interest. I'm hoping to complete this during the earlier part of this year. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Philip, and that was really interesting, and I'm very grateful to you for the very first talk in this series. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. You okay for questions?
Of course, yeah.
So Stuart Cunningham was asking, was the rate of desertion unusual for naval voyages of this period?
Well, that is a really good question, Stuart, because a few years after the Challenger expedition, there was a parliamentary inquiry into the, if you like, the operation of the Royal Navy. And there was an MP who is quoted as deploring the high turnover in the Navy, because what was happening was they were failing to establish a body of experienced a crew, the petty officers who had the command of the men, because they were older, more experienced, had more, if you like, a separation by age from these young men coming on board. Instead of which the more senior crew were very few years older than the men they were seeking to command and failing to do so. And the explanations for the turnover, even though conditions in the Navy had improved, they don't really come to light in this parliamentary inquiry. And although the Challenger expedition's demands on men were unusual, I think Erica Jones in her book speaks of the normal routine of a Marine would be of a sailor, Royal Navy sailor, would be to go from port to port unless they're in a battle. And the idea was to get from port to port as quickly as possible. There's no point in hanging around in the middle of the ocean, which is what the Challenger was doing. So they would rarely be more than a few weeks at sea before they came to another port, instead of which they were, stopping every 200 miles, sound the deep, move on, sound again. So although the conditions on the Challenger were unusual, I would say the context at the time was high turnover, but I've not been able to find, if you like, a typical turnover figure for any given Royal Navy ship. I'd love to find it. I don't know whether, therefore, this is unusual, but it does seem overall that if you set off with a crew of 200 and you end up having 400 names on your ship's register passing through the books over 3.5 years, that does seem like a really high turnover to me.
Could I make a comment there, comparing with the Gazelle expedition, which was going around the world at the same time?
Oh yeah,
I think there were fewer desertions there, but conditions on board, and particularly the health of the crew, was very much worse. They had a lot of deaths amongst the crew, and I wonder whether it was that the Challenger actually went to rather more pleasant places, The Gazelle didn't. It went to rather remote places, and maybe the Gazelle's crew actually thought the Gazelle, for all it being pretty horrible, was a better place than going ashore.
Did you mean the Gazelle was a better place than going ashore?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, I'm not trying to compete with, you know. I mean, that it does sound, yeah, the more remote the locations, um, you know, were the conditions so bad that there was loss of life through ill health, John?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Uh, I mean, at times there were 30% of the crew were disabled through illness. They had yellow fever and all kinds of nasty things and were quarantined when they got into Australia.
yeah. Were they really? Yeah.
Mm. So they
Well,
weren't allowed ashore.
no, sure. Well, that happened, of course, with the Challenger when they reached the West Indies on at least one occasion. And when the Challenger was sailing from Halifax towards St. Thomas, you know, the crew was struck with pneumonia. As one guy, George Wright, he was hospitalized in Honduras, I think. And I found the hospital records. You know, there were a lot of sailors there who were, yeah, brought to the hospital with ill health conditions such as you're describing. Fortunately, this guy recovered, but you know, plenty of them didn't. And it was very interesting to read if you like, the report of the hospital surgeons on how the kind of treatment they were providing. The pathology was, if you like, the personal care was of a very high standard, but they were not able to deal with, you know, the viruses, of course, because that knowledge did not exist. So some of the treatments to do with trying to tackle the fevers were just hopelessly wide of the mark, which no doubt will account for the fatalities after the ill health that you're describing.
Okay, because another question from Gillen Wood, which relates a bit to Stuart's question. So this says, I was struck by your figure of 29 desertions in Sydney. Could you explain again that number, the sources you relied on to tabulate it?
Sure. Okay. The 29 desertions figure comes from the New South Wales police records, because these records, they give the name and the description and the ship, not just of the Challenger, but of other ships from which sailors had deserted over the time period when the Challenger was in Sydney Harbour. So of the 29, I identified, I think it was 12 of them were not original crew, and 17, I think these are the right figures, 17 were original crew from the Ledger. And I think there were four men were recaptured. Three of them were boy sailors. That's 4 of the 29. The rest disappeared up country. 1 or 2 of them were captured, 50, 60 miles inland. But the source of the information, therefore, stems essentially from the police record, but is substantiated by the information in the ship's ledgers about, who was on board when they reached Sydney and who had joined the ship earlier, replacing other deserters. I hope that's clear.
Okay, so Stuart has another question. He says, it's the rate of desertion by Marines was small compared to sailors. So was that, I think he means drudgery. Was that to do with drudgery?
Well, the problem, possibly, but the problem I've got with the Marines data is that these figures are I've not been able to find all of the service records of the Marines on board. I've just found it a real headache trying to get the data through the National Archive. They're just all over the place. The Marines came from a whole range of regiments. Not all were near to the point of departure of the ship. So Chatham. And indeed, if anyone on this webinar can point me in the right direction, I really do need to complete that information. So I mean, there may have been more than 3 Marines deserted, but those are the only 3 that I can kind of verify as actually did so.
Okay. A question myself. You mentioned that Good and McGrath were sent to Merseyside for sort of serving on a ship, a punishment ship. Was that HMS Conway?
It was, I've forgotten the name of the ship. I'll send you the name of the ship. It wasn't Conway.
Yeah, interesting. Local
Yeah,
history.
yeah.
Okay. So, John, are we nearing the end now?
I think so. I thought that was fascinating.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Philip, and we're grateful to you for kicking this series off. The next talk we have is in February, 19th of February, when David Bowers will talk about Loch Ness, the Loch Ness Monastery, a tale of Edwardian scientists and monks. And we hope we can sort out all the Zoom problems by then, and we'll have more of a chat facility going. So thank you very much indeed. I'll stop the recording now. And this recording will be available on the Challenge Society website at some point.
Good. And thank you very much, Phil, for hosting, and John for helping get this set up. And just to say hi to Angela from the Challenger Society. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.